Hi, I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of the Bulletin. Here's a short clip from one of our segments in this week's episode. On Sunday, January 26, Wilson Velasquez Cruz was arrested for deportation by U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement outside his church while worship continued inside. Mr. Velasquez Cruz had previously entered the country illegally and been deported before re-entering illegally again and applying successfully for asylum. He was now living in the U.S. legally with his wife and 2 children and working full-time at a tire shop in an Atlanta suburb. Alongside ICE raids like these here in the U.S., the Trump administration has sought to flood the zone with executive orders relating to immigration, refugees, and humanitarian aid, sending a clear message that this new presidency will take a hard line on how it relates to its global neighbors.
All illegal entry will immediately be halted, and we will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came.
In the past week, funding to USAID was frozen, employees were put on leave, and foreign workers instructed to return home, with ambiguity about what the future holds for refugee resettlement, international disaster relief, and critical medical support. Both Republicans and Democrats alike have expressed increasing concern over the past few years about border policies and issues related to immigration. But recent actions have not garnered a similar consensus that the administration is necessarily moving in the right direction. Instead, Americans are deeply divided about how power should be wielded for the common good, and, more fundamentally, what that common good actually is. Today, Mike Cosper sits down with Roger Berkowitz, founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities, and professor of politics, philosophy, and human rights at Bard College, to talk about power, populism, and the plight of the refugee. It's a deep dive conversation, not quick with answers, but committed to thoughtful engagement with the most important questions. Welcome to the show.
Roger Berkowitz, welcome back to the Bulletin.
It's great to be here, Mike.
So what I had said after reading this story about Wilson Velasquez was, my gut was probably the majority of people, even of people who voted for Trump, I don't think they were voting for this. And I don't think it's going to wear well on the American people over time. The reaction online on the jungle of Twitter was to get a wave of people, most of them who have something about being a Christian in their bios, to say, I voted for exactly this. You've written about the sort of contemporary refugee crisis in the past. Can you give us a little context to help us understand, like, what is happening? Why is there this massive global refugee problem?
There's so much going on that it's sometimes hard to put it in boxes. And there's this idea that the Trump administration is flooding the zone so completely that we don't know how to respond. So maybe it's a good way, as you're suggesting, that we start with a very concrete problem, right? The refugee problem, the asylum problem, the immigration problem, the deportation problem. And let me say that I put that out there because there's not just one problem, but it starts with the refugee problem, as you rightly said. So I'm just looking, at the numbers right now, and according to the United Nations, which of course we know that some people don't think is so highly of these days, there are 122 million people in the world forcibly displaced from their homes. That's a lot. There's 68 million people internally displaced, and there's almost 40 million people who the UN calls refugees, and another 8 million people who they identify as asylum seekers. I mean, these are enormous numbers. I mean, this is bigger than some countries. And who are these people? Asylum is one of the oldest ideas of what we could call the comity of nations, or today we call international law. The idea that there's rules, whether they're written or customary, that bind nations to another. And one of the oldest was that if someone is unjustly persecuted and they come to your door for assistance, you let them in. It's just basic good hospitality, I think, of any religion and of any culture. The problem begins with refugees in the 1930s, when so many people become refugees around 3 events, we could even say. One is the breakdown of the Austro-Hungarian Empire the breaking up what was one of the most cosmopolitan empires in the world. I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had numerous nationalities and religions and peoples in it. And in the major cities, people lived together in harmony. When that empire broke up after World War I, suddenly you had new nation states that wanted to create nationalist, racial nation states and tons of minorities. So Germans were living in Czechoslovakia, Jews were living in all the countries, Poles were living in Bulgaria and Poland. And you had this problem of how do you protect the rights of minorities? Then, of course, in the Soviet Union, you have the pogroms. And then in Germany, you have the rise of the Nazis and the denaturalization of Jews, the deportation of Jews, and then the extermination of Jews. All of which is to say that you had the new phenomena of mass refugees. It's not just 1 or 15 people showing up at your border and, you give them hospitality. You're talking about hundreds of thousands. And we can talk about the moral foundations of asylum, and I believe in it 100%. But when hundreds of thousands or millions show up at your border, you have a whole new problem, right? It's an economic problem. It is an assimilation problem. You can't repatriate them, right? That's one option. You repatriate them, but you can't send them back because countries won't take them or they'll get killed. You can't naturalize them because first of all, just the bureaucracy to naturalize them is not there. You don't have the numbers. And secondly, people don't want to naturalize that many people all at once. And so, you have the problem. And that's unfortunately, the number of refugees around the world has been increasing at a very fast pace over the last 80 years. It hasn't gotten better. It's gotten worse. And whether you're in Europe and Germany, where throughout Europe there's a huge anti-immigrant movement, or whether you're in the United States, people are unhappy with the number of refugees coming in. You can say it for economic reasons, that it's depressing wages, and we can get into economic arguments all they want. Is it good for a country to bring in refugees or not? They do work, they pay taxes, there's a whole lot of argument. On the other hand, there's no doubt, while it may be good for the country as a whole, it's not good for certain classes of people, especially working class people. Their wages go down. That's just clear. And you can understand why working class people are upset. And so, there's a desire to have fewer immigrants, fewer asylum seekers, fewer refugees coming into the country. I think you have to separate, right, that issue from the issue of undocumented workers who are here. If they've been here for a couple of years, as Wilson Velasquez was, he works 6 days a week at a tire factory. He has 2 kids and a wife. They live in the community. They haven't committed any crimes. Now, again, he did commit one crime. He came over the border. In fact, he committed 2 crimes. He came over the border once 20 years ago. And as a result, he was deported and he's not allowed back in. He came over again. He applied for asylum. And as a result, he was here legally, even though he had come here illegally. From my point of view, it's just basic humanity, to use a out-of-fashion word, neighborliness, that you don't go and arrest people who have been here for 2 or 3 years. In this case, he was here a little over 2 years, and deport them out of their homes, churches, and schools. It's just something, it seems just ridiculous to me that we would do this. Unfortunately, if you try and understand where this is coming from, and that's sort of my job, you don't want to do too much, but you want to do a little of it. People are frustrated. They are frustrated that for years they've been angry about immigration. They've been angry about asylum. They've been angry about too many people here illegally, taking jobs, etc. And it seems that the establishment does nothing. It seems that even when Trump gets elected the first time, nothing can happen. And so there's a desire to really act quickly, to try and flood the zone, to overcome the legal resistance. A lot of this will end up being declared illegal or unconstitutional. A lot of it will be rolled back, but the desire to make a difference. I get that. I get the anger. I get the frustration. But to some degree, we have to not lose our basic humanity, right? I understand the world's going to change. I've been against, it used to be called illegal immigration. I don't know what we're supposed to call it today. Having undocumented people here for a long time, for a couple of reasons. One is I think having undocumented people in the country creates second-class citizenship. It creates an aura of illegality. These people have no legal rights or have few legal rights. And as a result, they can be abused and they can work for less money. They hurt the rule of law in this country. Not their fault, our fault. We bring them in. And the reason we bring them in largely is businesses want them because they depress prices. And two, liberals want them because they think it's the right thing to do. And three, wealthy people want them because it makes housekeepers and restaurants cheaper. So these are part of the system. We brought them here. They're part of a system that has been in for years. We've looked the other way. And, if you're going to change your policy, I think that's okay. It's legitimate. But don't just go and treat people like cattle or animals. And that's what I think is happening. And my inclination is that you're right, that the majority is upset by this, but it's probably not as large a majority as you and I would hope. And the question is, how many people are really upset about it? How many people do most of us know who are being deported? And this is the problem. People look around and say, my life's not changing very much. I do know a lot of Afghan and Ukrainian students, and they were invited here by the government, and they can work. And if they have their legality taken away, suddenly they can be deported. That to me is scary.
Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.